So today we will be discussing one of the most influential African American scholars who influenced a great deal of education, especially right after slavery, none other than Booker T. Washington. And for today, we'll be talking about his educational philosophies. We'll go over some things that he used to influence some of the ideologies in the education community. And we'll also briefly talk about his book, Up From Slavery. So we're gonna move on to our next slide. We're gonna do a quick synopsis of his life story. Booker T. Washington was born into slavery in 1856. He dedicated himself to education and started many schools for black students. He founded and was named the head of the Tuskegee Institute. It's a black university in Alabama, and he was one of the leaders of the African American community until his death in 1915. And Booker T. Washington drew most of his educational experiences from his time at Hampton University. And during this time, he began to develop a new ideology on how African Americans could literally become prominent members of society. Now, of course, his ideology was critiqued by many of those in the educational community. We'll talk about one of his key competitors, or one of his key individuals who definitely went against his doctrine, but none other than W.E. Du Bois. So let's move on to our next slide. So we have two opposing reactions right after the ending of slavery. When the first African Americans were granted freedom, there were two different ideologies that were starting to take over the country, especially in the South, on how African Americans could improve their livelihoods. We had the keynote speakers, Booker T. Washington, and as we stated earlier, one of his, he was actually a former colleague of Booker T. Washington. They were friends in the beginning, but as their ideologies began to shift, W.E. Du Bois became more so of a prominent competitor of Booker T. Washington. Let's move on to our next slide. So we have Booker T. Washington, and then we have W.E. Du Bois. All right, so we're gonna move on to our next slide. Booker T. Washington, as we talked about, he advocated compromise with whites through accommodation and gradualism, which is basically what we look as equality over time. Now, oftentimes what he would say is that instead of literally trying to take on racism head on, the ideology was, if we were to find a way to show that African Americans could become prominent members of the American society, over time equality would come, because whites would consider us valuable members of the community. And as you see here, this is a photo that was drawn of Booker T. Washington with Theodore Roosevelt, because he was one of the first African American advisors that actually was inside of the White House to advise the president. And this was something huge, especially for African Americans. We're gonna move on to our next slide. All right. So here, Booker T. Washington, he founded the Tuskegee Institute for Vocational Education so blacks could get slightly better jobs. So his ideology stated that basically that if African Americans, as far as education, focused fully on industry, they would be able to kind of uplift themselves and have a better opportunity to sustain themselves in a society. So in other words, the mindset was that if you became something of value, a valuable asset to the community, this would ultimately end racial discrimination. It would end racial disharmony. And so he focused on teaching African Americans on industrialization, as far as learning how to become better farmers, better engineers, better individuals who worked in construction. All of the jobs that were something that was going to be useful and continuing to build up America. Let's go on to our next slide. And now here we have W.E. Du Bois, and now we're going to talk about some of his criticism. W.E. Du Bois believed that most educated blacks, the talented 10th, is what he called them, should lead the fight for civil rights. In other words, his ideology differed so much from Booker T in the sense that he felt that African Americans should not have to gradually be accepted by whites, but it should be a human right granted. This here is an excerpt from the Du Bois essay, and it says the talented 10th. And from the very first, it has been the educated and the intelligent of the Negro people that have led and elevated the mass, and the sole obstacles that nullified and retarded their efforts were slavery and race and prejudice. So what he is saying that race and prejudice and slavery is the reason why African Americans were in the predicament that we're in, and it was up to the talented 10th to come in and to begin to lead the masses. Of course, this is a direct competition of what Booker T. Washington believed in. Let's go on to our next slide. Of course, W.E. Du Bois helped form the NAACP, which was the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. This is where these two began their heated feud, because Booker T. Washington, for the most part, worked on stopping the funding from the NAACP by literally talking to some of the funders and talking them out of funding the NAAC. And when W. Du Bois got word of this, this is where there was a major split. Let's keep going. And so we're going to stop here, and this is just a question of thought. And we're going to think about the main ideas when we're dealing with the two ideologies. And it's basically we're going to think about today, who had the better plan to fight Jim Crow? Was it Booker T. or W. Du Bois? So the concept of what we have to really think about in this construct is whether gradually formulating an ideology of kind of filling into society, finding a way to fit in, and then also accumulating enough wealth to put you in a position that you would be better off, that your family will have a better life, would be the better avenue in order to fight Jim Crow? Or would it be the talented 10th ideology from W. Du Bois, basically saying that the only way that African Americans could fight against Jim Crow laws is that they would receive full equality, full rights under the law? And so this is our essential question for today, which is, who had a better plan to fight Jim Crow? Was it Booker T. or W.E. Du Bois?